Have you ever stopped while reading a folktale and wondered where you've seen the story before? This is a common enough occurrence. Groups of folklorists, ethnologists, and anthropologists at one point formed the theory that such cross cultural similarities in myths and folktales could only have come about due to diffusion through historical contact or geographical proximity. And what this essentially means is that if a folktale from one part of the world resembles a folktale from another part of the world, it must be so because the people at some point had come in contact with each other. Now, this is glaringly, unavoidably true in some cases. And one I can think about is an island in the Asian Pacific, where for the longest time people couldn't understand why the folktales of the indigenous peoples were so similar to certain German folktales. And so for the longest time, it was baffling to everybody until it was eventually discovered that way, way, way long ago, a German missionary had made it to the island, had lived among the people, and had told stories which had worked its way into the folklore of the people. And then that mystery was solved. So glaringly, obviously true in some cases. But then the thing is, this way of thinking lends itself a bit too easily to prejudice, right? Because for many decades, scholars, mainly from the West, found it really hard to believe and accept the sheer quantity and complexity of myths and folktales coming from non-European sources. And so this fed into that racist idea that, oh, if there is a story or a folktale or a myth, then it had to have been from some contact. So this meant a whole lot of time was invested into determining the origins of myths and folktales, which, if you know anything about that, it can be quite the wild goose chase. But that doesn't make it any less fun to find a story which is strikingly similar to a story from another part of the continent you're on, or even better, that also occurs in other parts of the world. And so, that, my friends, is what we'll talk about in this week's episode of the Mythological Africans podcast. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Ndebele. You may know that the Ndebele of South Africa consists of two main branches, the Manala and the Nzunza. But do you know the story of how this came to be? Well, in one account, the story goes that after a long and successful reign, Chief Musi, who reigned in the 17th century, became blind and ill. And knowing he was approaching death, he decided to pass on chieftainship to his heir. Manala, his firstborn son, so the firstborn son of his first wife, was the successor entitled to the chieftainship of the Ndebele. But Manala's mother was dead, so his second wife, Chief Musi's second wife, and mother of his second-born son, Zunza, had taken over the old and sick king's care. So she overheard Musi telling Manala to come and see him in the morning. And realizing that Musi was about to hand over the accessories of Ubungwe Nyama, which would convey chieftainship to Manala, she went to Nzunza, her son, and said, "Get up early tomorrow because your father is dying and he wants to hand over the chieftainship to Manala." And to Manala, she said, "Tomorrow you must go and hunt wild buck for your father." And so the next morning, Manala gets up early and leaves, and Zunza goes to his father and presents himself as Manala. And his father, being old and blind, asks him to come closer so he could touch him and be sure because Manala had hairy skin. But Nzunza knew that his father would touch him to check, so he had put hairy skins on his arms and body to cover up. And so Musi touched Nzunza's hairy arms and believed that he was Manala, and so gave him the accessories of Ubungwe Nyama, including the royal Namrali oracle, which when you have that, then that's assured leadership. Manala, of course, was furious when he returned and heard about Zunza's deception, but the deed was done. And so began the conflict which split the Ndebele. And believe it or not, this continued until a court case in 2014, a mere 10 years ago, settled the case. In the court documents about the ruling, this court case, and that's where I got this account from. The account is said to have come from a 1921 book about the Ndebele, published by Hermanus Cornelis Martinus Fourie, who was a Dutch theologian. Now, you probably listened to this story and went, hey, that's the story of Jacob and Esau. And you would be correct. The similarities are quite striking. But what if I told you that a similar story occurs among another African people not even remotely close to the Ndebele in South Africa? That's right. The story of how the Ashanti people of Ghana came to settle in their present location in Ghana is essentially the same story. And the first known documentation of that account is in Robert Rattray's collection and discussion of Ashanti proverbs, which was published in 1916. And I'll read Rattray's account as it appears in the book. When the Supreme Being was premeditating as to where he should set down the abodes of his children on earth, the goat heard of it, and being a great friend of Bia, one of the Supreme Being's sons, ran and told him that when his father sent for Tano, his other son, and him, he should rise up and go very quickly, so he should arrive there before his brother. And so when the children were called before their father, Bia came first, and his father, as a reward, set his abode down in the coolness and shade of the forest country, whereas Tano was given a home in the more open grasslands. This story also appears in Tales Told in Togoland by A.W. Cardinal, and this was published in 1931. It appears in Geoffrey Parenda's West African Religion, a study of the beliefs and practices of Akan, Ewe, Yoruba, Igbo, and kindred peoples, published in 1949. It also appears in Harold Shub's A Dictionary of African Mythology, The Mythmaker as Storyteller, and that was published in the year 2000, as well as Patricia Ann Lynch's African Mythology A to Z, published in 2004. And these are documented sources. I'm not making a comment on the different Ashanti storytellers who have kept this tradition alive and continue to tell this story. And in some of the other versions, in these other books, the roles are reversed. So the goat prefers Tano to Bia, and so Bia is the one who is duped. And fun fact, I discussed this story as well as the case of goats in African folklore in the animal tales section of my upcoming book, the Watkins Book of African Folklore. If you want to know more about this story, especially as far as how goats factor into the myth and folklore of African people, you should definitely get the book. It's coming out next year, March 11th. Now, is it possible that the story, scandalous as it is, found its way from European Christian explorers or missionaries into the oral law of two different people on opposite ends of the African continent? Absolutely. I mean, if you're anything like anybody anywhere, you love a good story, right? Especially if it's a scandalous story and, there's trickery and kingship. I mean, this is drama, right? So we love these stories. But then if you know anything about the mischief and machinations and resulting mayhem around succession issues on the African continent, you will agree that it is also entirely possible that something similar happened on the African continent. Think about it. An old and infirm king who gets duped by his wives who wanted their sons to be the king, or a trusted advisor who wants an unpopular but rightful heir to be set aside for a more popular or manipulable heir. Like the possibilities are limitless. And, again, succession struggles, bitter fighting wars, the things they have caused on the African continent. I personally think that this story is indigenous to the African continent, and people probably recognized it in the biblical account, and things started mixing, as you know, if people were not able to tell their own traditional stories, then they just sprinkle a little bit of Bible in there and carried on with life, as tends to happen sometimes. But I wrote a thread on X or Twitter a while ago about how to read mythology and folklore, because what happens is, a lot of times a story like this comes up, and then it comes a whole argument about, where did this story come from, and Does it matter who first told the story? Is it African people abandoning their traditions for biblical stories? Is it an African story that migrated to the Middle East and got into the Bible? And you get this whole brouhaha about who first told the story and who does the story belong to. So this thread about how to read mythology and folklore is not a prescriptive attempt to tell anyone how to do anything, but it's more an exploration of how scholars generally approach the topic of mythology and folklore, and the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. So the different ways in which people study them, analyze them, structure them, how these approaches relate to each other and how they evolve from each other. And it's a pretty good thread, if I do say so myself. So I will put a link to it in the episode notes. But what I ultimately arrived at after taking it all in were just a series of questions that helped me integrate the stories and make sense of them, first for myself, but also for public curation, right? And usually I start at how does the story make me feel on a gut, instinctual, intuitive level about myself, about other people, about plants, about animals, and the rest of the world that I share space with. And on a more meta level, what do they reveal about how we can be on the planet with each other and in the cosmos? What do they reveal about human values, the things we've held sacred or relied on for personal or community growth and enlightenment, and what worked, what didn't work? What kind of societies and civilizations did these stories and myths come from? And what might the connections be? Because stories carve civilizations, believe it or not. And what do they say about just the universals of human nature in the world that we live in? And so like I said, there'll be a link to the thread in the episode notes, but I am really interested to know if you know a similar story from your corner of the world. Could be African continent, could be elsewhere. I am really curious because it would be fun to kind of get a sense of how this particular setup manifests in other parts of the world. So hey, come tell us about it. And thanks as always for listening, and I will see you next week.